North Carolina has been setting the standard for state level tax reform for nearly a decade now. Don't believe me? Well, perhaps you'll believe our next guest. Jonathan Williams is chief economist and executive vice president of policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. Welcome back, Jonathan. Good to talk to you again.
Well, thanks for having me back, Mitch. Always good to talk with you and talk about a successful case study of a state that's done things right in North Carolina.
The reason that we're chatting with you is actually not about developments that are taking place in North Carolina right now, but actually because you just co-wrote a piece that's in the Des Moines Register in Iowa. I guess the folks in the Hawkeye State are looking at tax reform right now.
They are. And so a friend of mine, John Hendrickson at the Tax Education Foundation, and I put together this piece after talking with many state legislators, and they're looking at ways to really become more competitive through real pro-growth tax reform in Iowa. It's a state that's been left behind, is oftentimes we talk about states that can fall behind simply by standing still. And Iowa is a state that had higher than average tax rates. And while they haven't raised taxes recently, we've seen, more than 35 states substantially reduce taxes over the last 6 or 7 years across the country. And especially pre-pandemic with some of the historic economic numbers that we had, many states used that opportunity to cut down tax rates. And so what happened now in Iowa is we see a lot of the critics, people who want higher taxes and higher spending, talk about the Kansas case study. And we've heard about this many, many times, that you can never cut taxes or even consider cutting taxes in your state because somehow tax cuts ruined the state of Kansas under Sam Brownback 10 years ago. Now, obviously, we had to play a little bit of a Mythbusters episode here with the op-ed to kind of tell what actually happened in Kansas, which in short was Kansas lawmakers overspent, and they cannot cut taxes and increase spending like they did in Kansas. They increased spending in the year of the tax cuts actually by something like $430 million in that budget year. And so should anybody be surprised that they had a budget problem in Kansas? And of course, then what we did in the piece was kind of do a tale of two states, if you will, Kansas versus North Carolina, of really one of the gold standards, as we point out in the piece, in North Carolina of tax reform that was done right, and contrast that to a lot of the perceptions out there that we see in Iowa today.
I want to repeat the words that you just used, and that was describing North Carolina as a state that is somewhat of a gold standard for tax reform. You monitor these state level tax policies across the country. What is it about what North Carolina has done since 2013 that would allow it to be called the gold standard?
Well, there's several things I point to. And of course, for those that are in more of the details of North Carolina policy, I'm sure there's additional nuances to this. But the big picture items that we follow are, when you went from a graduated so-called progressive tax system in North Carolina down to a flat tax at the state level. That is a big, heavy political lift to do, but it's exactly the right thing to do in terms of making your state more competitive and getting the rates down as a result, where all rates got collapsed down into the single flat rate. That was an amazing development. Getting rid of the death tax, for instance, a huge impediment to keeping retirees and business owners in the state. We see the out-migration effect of so many states that have high level of death taxes in their states, as well as high marginal income tax rates, as people continue to vote with their feet away from those kind of high tax states to more friendly states with death taxes and lower income tax rates. And then you look at overall the corporate side. This is a huge development where I'm out in the States, often in a non-COVID environment, usually in 30, 35 states a year, talking about tax reform. And I ask people, as only somewhat of a rhetorical question, what do you think the corporate tax rate is in North Carolina today? And because I go through the example of North Carolina's tax reform, and I'll get, 4%, maybe 4.5%, 5%. But when I say North Carolina's corporate tax rate is only 2.5% after the tax reform, the lowest of any state that has a business income tax, most of them are floored and say, we really have to do something about our rate, because as businesses are always looking at new ways to expand, And as we've seen in California's case, losing HP Enterprises recently, Oracle, some of the major tech companies that have been based there in Silicon Valley for decades, businesses are always on the move. And guess what? They're looking at how much price the state puts on having work and investment and savings and business location in one state versus the other. We know that these 50 laboratories of democracy are all in direct competition with each other. And that is just the level of a price that you put on doing business in North Carolina versus the other states. And thankfully, and luckily for all of you in North Carolina, you've put a very low price relatively to other states across the country, and you're seeing the results.
Now, one reason for inviting you on is a bit of a pat on the back for North Carolina because we've done things in many respects right and could be considered a gold standard. But another reason is to remind people that these things aren't static. You referenced earlier that one of the reasons Iowa is considering reform is because so many other states have done the same. North Carolina just can't sit here and pat ourselves on the back and say, hey, we're great and everyone else should follow us. We need to be paying attention to what other states are doing too, and perhaps continuing to look for ways to make our tax code even better, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's really two parts to that story. Is one, you absolutely deserve some great credit. And we go out there and talk up North Carolina all the time because of the heavy lifting that was done to get you in a place where, let's say in our rich states, poor states analysis for economic outlook, you've improved from 26th all the way to 5th best in terms of economic outlook because of these changes. We shouldn't short sell that whatsoever. And you look at this idea of a federal bailout of states. It's not North Carolina that's out there lobbying for a federal bailout, because guess what? With the extra competitiveness in migration, new businesses, you've restocked your rainy day fund and the unemployment insurance fund and all the other things that states that have seen this out migration because of high taxes have not done. You've been exactly in the right spot there. So I don't want to minimize how good of a job you have done, but on the other hand, states absolutely do fall behind by standing still. And so being at 5th place is great. But if you don't continue to make positive action in terms of free market reforms, there's a good chance that other states are certainly looking at entering the top 5 and looking at what can we do to replicate or even go further than what North Carolina did. Just a couple of quick items that I've seen in the states so far this year of states that would go farther is West Virginia and Mississippi. Both of those where their governors, Governor Tate Reeves in Mississippi and Governor Jim Justice in West Virginia, have proposed as part of their policy priorities for this year, eliminating totally the personal income tax, as well as legislative majorities, Speaker Philip Gunn on our ALEC board of directors. They're right there looking to eliminate income taxes completely. And I know, talking to my good friend Jason Sain in North Carolina, he'd like to make continuous progress, but that's what it takes. There's some very serious states out there that are looking to take over North Carolina's spot in the top 5 and get to number 1, where Utah has been for all 13 editions of rich states, poor states so far. So the competition at the top, as in any kind of competition, is the most fierce, right? And so states are absolutely looking at how they can kind of steal some of the good ideas that you've accomplished in North Carolina and maybe even take it a step further.
I want to loop back to something else you talked about earlier, because you have, and this is not something new, this is something that's been going on for several years, contrasted North Carolina and its picture with the one in Kansas. And one of the major differences was Kansas cut taxes, good news, overspent, bad news. North Carolina did not have that situation. How important is it for this state and also for the national picture for state level tax reform that North Carolina not get into the habit of spending more than is required and available based on our tax code?
Well, the answer is, in short, it's essential that states balance spending with taxes, because at the state level, spending is taxation. And as Art Laffer, my co-author in Rich States, Poor States, always says, it's not rocket surgery. This is economics and it's budgeting and it's financial management 101. Taxes equal spending. And you got to keep that in mind. And one of the great things in case studies we follow all the time at the states is states that have institutionally in their state constitutions or in state law have put requirements on the growth of spending to make sure that government does not grow faster, let's say, than the private sector or individual taxpayers personal income. Colorado is probably the model here in terms of their taxpayers' Bill of Rights that they've had in their state constitution for 25 plus years now that has protected Colorado taxpayers, even as the state has transitioned politically from red to purple to probably blue now. Colorado still has a very pro-growth tax policy because they've been able to balance spending and tax needs through something like a taxpayer Bill of Rights.
Speaking of that, one of the priorities we have at the John Locke Foundation moving forward is something similar called a TEL, taxpayer expenditure limit, that would go into the Constitution that would function in some respects like what Colorado is doing. Based on your vantage point, watching how the policies play out across the country, how advantageous would it be for North Carolina to have something like that that's built into the law, built into the Constitution, and not just dependent on a legislature that on its own has good fiscal sense?
Well, you've been blessed with some really good legislators over the last decade in North Carolina that have had leadership that have, in many cases, kept spending naturally at that type of a reasonable level. But you can't always expect that that's going to be the case, right? And so I think to prepare for an eventuality where maybe, regardless of party, who's in power, they may have big spending interests and it may get taxes and spending out of whack in the future. That's why I think it's so essential to address these institutional spending controls that protect taxpayers and put those into the state constitution. And of course, it needs to look like what works in North Carolina. You can't just take Colorado's taxpayer Bill of Rights. It needs to be customized as any state would to the needs of their state. And so that's why I'm very excited to hear about your initiative to kind of look at ways to protect taxpayers over the long term and really hopefully cement this top 5 ranking in rich states, poor states, and economic competitiveness for North Carolina for many years ahead.
As we wrap up, Jonathan, any special message you would send to policymakers in North Carolina who are making decisions about taxes and spending for ways that they can keep North Carolina in this enviable position?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of the same things and themes that we've been talking about. It's really easy to have competitiveness slip away from underneath you as other states are moving ahead quickly. And I know this very well working with our ALEC members across the country. Is so many are, rightly so, devoted to the business going on in their state capital, that there's all these things moving on in the other 49 states that very easily states can make some pretty dramatic gains in terms of competitiveness, and maybe in the case of North Carolina, knock you out of the top 5 for economic outlook in a very short amount of time. And so continuing to kind of keep moving ahead, looking at what the true north is when it comes to free market, fiscal responsible policies, and then looking at ways to chip those rates down even further. Wouldn't it be amazing, Mitch, if we were having this conversation in a couple of years and North Carolina was an income tax free state like West Virginia and Mississippi might be very soon, or get rid of that corporate income tax that's at 2.5. Things like that, in addition to a tax and expenditure limitation, could be exactly what is needed from a policy development position to get North Carolina to number 1.
Jonathan Williams is Executive Vice President of Policy and Chief Economist at the American Legislative Exchange Council, also known as ALEC. Jonathan, thanks so much.
Well, thanks for having me back, and always good to talk about a state that does it right.